So I'll start by mentioning that this talk summarizes a chapter of mine that was published in the recent Human Enhancements for Space Missions volume. So if you want to see the more detailed presentation of the arguments, please consult my chapter in that volume. So to set the context here, what I notice is that a lot of the discussion that surrounds space settlement, including the ethics of space settlement, really seems to be inspired by a pragmatic perspective that says something like, well, we should settle space first as soon as we can and worry about some of these ethical considerations, later, if at all. And one of the ideas that's come out of this perspective is something that, maybe it'll be easier, cheaper, and safer to survive in space, which of course is always trying to kill you, if we implement various possible or not, modifications to our bodies. And a quick note about terminology. I'm going to prefer the term modification to enhancement because I worry that the term enhancement kind of prejudges things. If you're enhancing something, you're making it better. And I don't want to assume in advance that that is actually the case. And modification I take to be a more neutral term to describe changes to one's body that would alter its survivability in various kinds of harsh conditions. So an example of an argument that's been made by Conrad in a recent paper, Conrad and others, goes something like this, that the emerging philosophy of human enhancement in space holds that astronauts should be allowed to increase their adaptive capacity for living in a space environment because it's such a challenging one. In this context, human enhancement is not treated as an extravagance without a pragmatic rationale, but as a necessity justified by both humane concerns and practical biological requirements. So the idea here is we can maybe sidestep some of the objections we might raise to biological modifications in terrestrial contexts by pointing to them as necessities, or at least as greatly facilitating of survival in space. And so does it actually follow that we can sidestep the kinds of objections we might raise in the more general human enhancement debate in the case of space? And I'm going to argue that we can't in a particular kind of way. So I want to start with a thought experiment. So suppose an eccentric billionaire uses all of their wealth to create a self-sustaining utopia on an uninhabited island, a kind of idyllic paradise that many humans dream of. They send an open invitation to the rest of the world. Anyone is free to join the society up to a certain maximum number of persons that can be sustained. However, there are to be no accommodations for disabilities on the island, no ramps, no elevators, no braille signs. The idyllic paradise will be designed exclusively for non-disabled persons. So think about this for a moment. Think about what your reaction to it is and what response on behalf of the eccentric billionaire you think might be appropriate were disabled persons to request some kind of inclusion in this idyllic settlement. And I think your reaction to this is going to serve as an indicator of how you model disability implicitly. And so maybe you reacted in a way that said, well, this is okay for the eccentric billionaire to do this, but perhaps they should offer treatments to those who are disabled, so treatments for disabled persons to enable them to successfully live on this island without ramps, elevators, braille signs, and so forth. And if that's your perspective, it sounds like you've got a medical model of disability where you see disability as a purely medical phenomenon that resides in the body, and so disability just is being impaired in some way. There's an identity between disability and impairment, and that impairment is a real thing that bodies can have independent of other considerations. So there is a sort of natural category of impaired body. But maybe your reaction is slightly different. You should say, well, what the eccentric billionaire should do is build some ramps, build some elevators, install some braille signs, make the environment one that's navigable by disabled persons. And this would indicate that you maybe have what's known as the social model of disability implicitly, that views disability as a social construct which arises because the social environment is what's disabling to persons with impairment. So the social model theorists are going to say that impairment is a real thing. It does make sense to talk about a body being functionally impaired, but disability is not the same thing as that. Disability only arises when functional impairments cause problems in the built environment, when the built environment is not adequately accommodating of persons with impairments. That's when disability arises. And so the solution to disability is to ensure that the built environment is as accessible as possible. Now, I think we have good reasons to reject both of these conceptions of disability. And in particular, I'd like to advocate for an understanding of disability I'd argue for by Melinda Hall, developed by Melinda Hall, what she calls the cultural model of disability. And so what Hall is going to point to here is that our understandings of notions like sickness and health, of normal and abnormal, of functional and non-functional, these are always shaped by highly contingent cultural factors, that these are things that don't necessarily exist, but that we judge to be the case. And so what's going to be the case under this cultural model is that neither impaired nor disabled wind up being joint carving notions, even in application to human forms of embodiment. These are not things, these are not objective properties of bodies, but these are merely imposed categories, and they are within our power to shape, and they are shaped by cultural factors. And so what disability amounts to, according to Hall, is a complex interplay between both embodiment and the social world, and that stigma is a crucial driver in the construction of disability. That bodies only become disabled when they're subject to some kind of cultural stigmatization of being regarded as sick bodies. So the sick, non-sick is not a distinction that biology provides, for instance. It's something that we impose on what we see. There's no such thing as normal and abnormal bodies, but there are bodies that are regarded as normal, that are regarded as abnormal. There's no such thing as a functional versus a non-functional body, but there are bodies that are regarded as functional and regarded as non-functional. And if you do not consider yourself to be a disabled person, then congratulations. All that means is that you exist in a culture, in a society that did not categorize your body as a disabled one, but a different society could easily have done so. Because the faintest whiff, Hall will say, the faintest whiff of deviation from the norm is enough for the pernicious effects of stigma to operate. So our cultures could vary, and different cultures could have different conceptions of what being disabled amounts to. And the fact of someone being disabled or not in a given culture is a contextual matter, is a contingent matter, and these are things that are within our power to adjust by changing cultural norms. So what justice amounts to for disabled persons is not going to be limited to offering them medical treatments or accommodations. But in addition to that, or maybe even instead of that, what we should do is aim to remove stigma surrounding forms of embodiment. If we take justice for disabled persons seriously, our focus should be on eliminating stigmatization of different forms of embodiment, of no longer regarding different forms of embodiment as abnormal or as sick, and so forth. And so if that's the approach we take, and I think it is the approach we ought to take, then the implications for our thought experiment should be clear, that this eccentric billionaire is going wrong because their idea of creating a society that's only open to non-disabled persons is only going to reinforce the stigmatization of disabled persons. It's going to perpetuate the very thing that was wrong about the culture in the first place. Well, wasn't this talk supposed to be about space? Well, let's tweak our thought experiment a little bit. So now suppose that our eccentric billionaire has developed the means to transport large groups of people to initiate the settlement of Mars, fulfilling in the process a dream held by many humans. They send an open invitation to the rest of humanity that anyone is free to join the settlement up to a certain maximum number that can be sustained. However, each settler will be required to be altered in ways that enable them to survive exposure to Martian conditions through, for example, procedures which change their oxygen, radiation, temperature, and pressure tolerances or requirements, presuming that that's possible. There are to be no pressure-sealed, heated habitats to support baseline or unmodified humans. This settlement will be designed exclusively for persons modified to live on Mars. Now, if you think about this situation, what that would mean is that every single person listening to this talk would be lethally disabled in that culture, right? We've got this community where everyone's been modified and the people that haven't been modified are going to die within seconds. So we could imagine that the culture that would develop in such a society would be quite likely to form deep stigmas surrounding bodies that aren't able to cope with the endemic Martian conditions. And a result of this could quite likely be the sort of permanent establishment of a very ableist culture in this Martian society. And that's both to their and our detriment. To their detriment, because like it or not, disabled people will continue to come into existence, and if the society has no mechanism for accommodating those persons, they're going to lose out on productive members of society. That's going to be an argument from Sherry Wells Jensen. But to our detriment, because it's going to close off the possibility of participation of many people who might like to engage in Mars settlement, if it's only open to people that are willing to sort of surrender various aspects of their bodily autonomy. Now, so do we have to pursue things this way? Is this the only option? Is this the best option? And I think that the folks that are advocating for it have something like this argument in mind, where we can point out that space settlement is very expensive, that it's something that it would be nice to realize on a very short time scale. And so, we need to do whatever's necessary for realizing it as quickly as possible. And if bodily modifications will make it happen cheaper and more quickly, then perhaps they are morally obligatory, which would imply then that inclusiveness of disabled persons in particular is a luxury that we simply can't afford. So how can one respond to this kind of argument? Well, if we look at one of the initial claims that space settlement is something that we need urgently, I think this is an open empirical matter. There are going to be good arguments saying that, we've got time to wait or that we need to do it as quickly as possible. But either way, we don't already have the technology that would be needed to support, these extensive modifications to live unaided on the Martian surface. And so autumn flies can is going to defeat any urgent case for pursuing space settlement by means of mandatory bodily modifications, at least for the time being. So that argument, that point is kind of a wash. It doesn't get us a justification for modified settlements. It just gets us a justification for space settlement. What about this claim that if bodily modifications will make it happen cheaper and more quickly, then they would be obligatory? Well, I think the antecedent here is unsettled. We don't know for sure that bodily modifications will be cheaper, all things considered, will occur prior to other kinds of technology that could enable space settlement that's more inclusive. And in comparison to space habitat technology, I'd say that the HabTech is much further along. But we don't really know which of these technologies will mature first, nor which are going to be cheaper. But that doesn't mean we're powerless to affect the future here. Our values could affect our funding priorities, and our funding priorities can affect the pace at which technological developments occur. And so if we decided to throw a lot of effort into space habitat technology, we could well make that affordable prior to the maturation of the kind of biotechnology that we would need to have a sort of largely modified space settlement. And so there's more that's in our power here than I think many people realize. We are not powerless to affect the outcomes of research, although those outcomes tend to be unpredictable. They are not entirely outside of our control. And an important point here is just the reminder that designing for accessibility from the start is always going to be cheaper than renovating later on. So if you think disabled persons ought to be included in space settlement, you are going to have a much easier time facilitating realizing that goal if you plan for it from the start. And I think that you're not going to be able to effectively do that unless disabled persons are included, unless they're there helping you construct the settlement. Because as a non-disabled person, I will freely admit that I probably don't have the right kind of intuitions to know, if a problem comes up in the design of the settlement, what solution is going to be one that remains accessible to disabled persons. As a non-disabled person, I don't have the best means by which to make that judgment. So if there aren't disabled persons there providing input, helping out in the construction, it becomes much less likely that you will produce a settlement that is genuinely accessible. Now, there's one more claim I want to respond to here, which is the idea that, what we ought to do is whatever's necessary for realizing space settlement as quickly as possible. And I think this is really the main source of dispute between folks like me and more pragmatically inclined individuals. And I don't have any knockdown arguments against this position, but I do want to raise a bit of trouble for it. I think it's easy for people that are, very excited about space exploration, space settlement in particular, to lose sight of the idea that we're talking about human beings and human lives and human well-beings and what it means for humans to live a life worth living. And that humans do not exist just to perpetuate the species at any cost, and we should not be relegated to those roles and not afforded any other opportunities. And yes, it's true that people and that cultures will adapt to their physical environments, and that folks living in a Martian society are going to have to adapt to the conditions on Mars, and that differences could arise. But that doesn't mean we're justified in placing people into any environments whatsoever, especially ones where we have good reason to expect that, the adaptations are going to be rather repressive and ableist, that ableist cultural practices will be adaptive. And what I would suggest is that space settlement just isn't worth it if it doesn't do well by the people involved in the endeavor, and that we should put people first, not the species first, when we're thinking about space settlement. And what this comes down to is that a lot of this stuff is going to be the result of choices, not necessity. There's no specific way we have to do things. There are all kinds of different ways we might pursue space settlement, and we have a choice between them. We have a choice as to about pursuing space settlement in ways that are more versus less inclusive. If we pursue space settlement by requiring bodily modifications, that will be because we chose to do so, not because we had to do so. And our early choices are always going to be ones that can have a dramatic impact on future possibilities. And I would advocate for opting for choices that maximize possibilities, that maximize inclusion, rather than ones that narrow our possibilities down specifically to only the inclusion of people that have agreed to some fairly extensive biological modifications. Thank you.